right, good morning. So today we are going to move on to another method to solving the quadratic formula, the quadratic equation or function, and that is going to be quadratic formula. So quadratic formula, you may have heard of it before. The advantage to it is it can be used for any type of quadratic equation. So last week we had gone over solving by square roots, but that method could only be used when the b value was 0 and you only had an x squared and just numbers, no other variables. The quadratic formula, however, can be used for anything. So it's a little bit longer, but it's really just plugging into the formula and then working it out. So the quadratic formula is right here in this box. So to find or solve for your x, it's going to be the negative b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and then that is all going to be divisible by 2a. So the thing with this is you might notice there's a plus minus in there, which means that that's going to be done two different ways, once with the plus and once with the minus. And that's going to get you those two different answers. Now, let's think about this for a minute, right? So if you're adding and subtracting whatever you get from this radical here, if you had a positive number in there, you're going to get two square roots, which is why there's that plus minus there, because you're going to get the positive and the negative. If you have a 0 in there, however, adding or subtracting a 0 isn't going to give you two different answers. It'll only be one solution in that situation. And then just as we've gone over previously, if you have a negative number in there, that's just no solution, which will mean the parabola would not go through the x-axis and you won't have any solutions. So when we're finding or solving for x with the quadratic formula, we're really solving those x-intercepts. So if you have a parabola going through and you have two x-intercepts, that's what you're solving for. Now, if you had a parabola that was just maybe touching the x-axis in one spot, that would be when you get a 0 in there. And of course, as we've talked before, sometimes there's parabolas that don't actually cross, and that would be when you have a negative inside there, and that's no solution. Now, this portion here inside the radical, this little piece here, is called the discriminant. And you really want to find out what that is. You don't want to do this entire thing on your calculator at once, because if you find out that just this part in here is a negative, you really don't have to do anything else. You're just going to say there's no real solutions. If you try to put this entire thing in your calculator, first of all, you're going to have to do it twice because there's a plus and a minus. So that would be kind of challenging because you're going to need a bunch of parentheses and everything. So you really want to find the discriminant first. See what kind of number you have. If it's a 0, that makes it easy. If it's a negative, that makes it easy because it's no real solution. If it's a positive, then you finish the problem out for the positive and the negative. Okay, so the steps to using the quadratic formula. Step 1, put it in standard form, identifying a, b, and c. So remember, your standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c. Everything on one side of the equal sign. And then you identify your a, b, and c. Then you're going to substitute the a, b, and c values into the formula, simplify, find the discriminant first. So find the discriminant first, and then solve for those solutions. Okay, so let's take a look at example 1. So it says solve x squared plus 9x plus 14 equals 0. Now it's already in standard form. Everything is on one side of the equal sign and just that equal to 0, or if it had y equals, that would be fine too. So we're just going to go ahead and find the a, b, and c. So the a would be in this case a positive 1 because it's the number in front of the x squared. B would be positive 9 because it's the number in front of the x. And c is going to be your constant, the 14 at the end. So now you want to plug into the formula. So x equals negative b plus minus the square root of b squared, so that's 9 squared, minus 4 times a times c, and that's all going to be over 2 times a. Now the first thing you want to do is figure out what is in here, and that's called the discriminant, like I said. So don't do anything else. Don't try to do this whole thing on your calculator. You're just going to do what's inside the radical. Don't actually calculate the radical part yet. So this is really just -9, right? This is plus minus. This is your radical, and 2 times 1 is 2. So all I'm going to do is this part inside the radical. Don't square root it yet, because if it's a negative, you won't be able to do it anyway, and you need to know what kind of number's in there. So you're going to go to your calculator, and you're going to go ahead and do 9 squared minus 4 times 1 times 14. Notice I did not do a square root, right? You want to find out what's inside of that square root. And I get 25. Okay, so we know that this is now a 25 in here. Okay, so that's really important because, well, I don't like how it does that, but when you have a positive number in here, your discriminant is positive, you're going to have 2 answers, the positive and the negative, right? So that's what we have to do. If you had a negative in there, you would just write no real solution. You'd be done with the problem. You'd move on. If you had a 0 in there, then you can get rid of the radical because square root of 0 is 0. That's why you want to find out the number inside first, because it saves you work in some situations. So now that we have a 25, I'm going to set this up, but I have to do it the 2 ways. So I'm going to have x equals -9 plus 5 over 2. And then I have -9 minus 5 over 2. So we know square root of 25 is 5, but it could be positive or negative, right? So now you just want to solve each of these. So -9 plus 5 is -4, and -4 over 2 is -2. So that's one of your solutions. Then over here, -9 minus 5 would be -14 over 2, which will be equal to -7. And those would be the 2 places where this would cross the x-axis if you were graphing that parabola. So just to kind of give you the visual to tie it back to what we had done in earlier sections, we have x squared. I believe it's plus 9x plus 14. Just want to make sure I did that correctly. Yes. And then if we graph it, hopefully it'll show up. There's your parabola. It's crossing through at -2 and 3, 4, 5, 6, -7. So that's where we got those 2 answers from. Okay, so that's pretty much it. So we're just going to practice some more of these, and I'll show you a couple situations. Like in the next problem, it's not in standard form already, so we're going to put it in standard form first. So you'll notice on this one, the equal sign's kind of in the middle of the problem. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to move everything to one side. Now, it doesn't matter which side you go to, so whatever one seems easier. So I would probably move my 8 over since there's more stuff already on the left. So then I would have 2x squared minus 3x minus 8, and then now it's just going to equal 0. So now my a value is 2, my b is -3, and my c is -8. And now we're going to plug into the quadratic formula. So -b, now notice my b is already negative, but the formula also has a negative, which means that it will eventually become positive, right? Then we have plus minus b squared, so -3 squared. Make sure there's parentheses or you'll get that wrong when you do your calculator. Minus 4 times times a, which is 2, times c, which is -8, and then on the bottom, 2 times a. So first thing we want to do is simplify and really finding this discriminant in here. Now, usually the -3, I can just do that in my head and change that to a positive, right? And on the bottom, we all know 2 times 2 is 4. So those I'm just doing in my head to simplify those. This part here, you can do it on paper, in your head, in the calculator, whatever works, but you need to put parentheses around that -3 because when you square a negative, it's going to become positive. If you don't have your parentheses there, it is not going to work out correctly. So we're going to do -3 squared. All right, so we have -3 squared minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is negative 8. You need to put it in with the parentheses. So we end up with positive 73 in there. If you didn't put the parentheses, you're going to have a different number. Okay, now, 73 is not something that we can take the square root of and get an even number, right? So square root of 73 works out to this decimal 8.54, whatever. So what I'm going to do in that case, I'm not going to bother putting that decimal. I'm just going to leave this the way it is for now. And I'm going to separate my problem into the two different options. So the first one is 3 plus the square root of 73 divided by 4. And the second option is 3 minus the square root of 73 divided by 4. Now, the reason why I did that is because sometimes when you're doing a quizzes for homework or you're doing a real quiz or whatever, the answers will be left in radical form. So you will actually see it written like this: 3 plus square root of 73 over 4, 3 minus square root of 73 over 4. Sometimes you'll see the answers as decimals. So I want to make sure you can do it both ways. So right now we have the answers in radical notation. And now I'm going to put this in my calculator and get the decimals, and we'll round them to 2 places, okay? So 3 plus the square root of 73. Now make sure you hit equals or enter and then divide it by the 4. And you get 2.886, which I'll round to 2.89. That's one solution. Now we're going to do 3 minus. So 3 minus the square root of 73. And we're going to divide that answer by 4. And we get negative 1.39. Negative 1.39. So now you have the answers in either form that you need. So depending on the quiz or the assessment, sometimes the multiple choice answers will be given as decimals. Sometimes they'll be given in radical notation. You just want to make sure you can, kind of toggle between the two options depending on what's there. Okay, and that's pretty much it. So we're just going to review a little bit. Okay, so using quadratic formula to find the x-intercepts. So let's take a look at this one here. So we know A is 1, B is 5, and C is the negative 6. So x equals negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C. And that's going to go over 2 times A. Now, of course, I have negative 5 plus minus, and on the bottom, 2 times 1 is 2. And I'm going to focus on my discriminant here, which is the number inside the radical. So 5 squared minus 4 times, what else did I have there? 1 and negative 6, right? Times positive 1 times negative 6. And we have a 49 in there. Now 49 is nice because that is a perfect square. So now I know when I go to my two solutions here, I have negative 5 plus 7, because square root of 49 is 7. And I also have negative 5 minus 7. Now, of course, negative 5 plus 7 is 2, and 2 over 2 is 1. And negative 5 minus 7 would be negative 12, and negative 12 over 2 is negative 6. So those are my two solutions for that one. Okay, so let's take a look at number 2. So we have negative 1, which is A, negative 2 is B, and 5 is C. So again, we're just plugging into that quadratic formula. So the formula is negative B, so I have negative negative 2 plus or minus the square root of B squared. Make sure when it's negative, you're putting it in parentheses. Minus 4 times A, which is negative 1, times C, which is positive 5. On the bottom, 2 times A, so 2 times negative 1. Figuring out that discriminant, that's what you want to do first, right? So I have positive 2 plus or minus, whatever this is going to be, over negative 2. So I'm going to do this part of my calculator. So I have negative 2 squared minus 4 times negative 1 times, I think it was positive 5, right? Yes. And that gives me a 24. Now, 24 is not a perfect square. If you're not sure and you go to your calculator and you try to do square root of 24, you'll realize it's not a perfect square. So when that happens, you're going to split it up to plus the square root of 24 over negative 2 and to minus the square root of 24 over negative 2. Now, there are ways you could solve this by simplifying radicals, but we haven't done that, so we're just going to use the calculator and get decimals. So 2 plus the square root of 24. Make sure you hit equals before you do the dividing, and it's divided by negative 2. So you have negative 3.45. And then the other solution, you've got 2 minus the square root of 24, and that's divided by negative 2 as well. And you have 1.45. And there's your two solutions for that example. All right, so you can kind of get the idea, hopefully. I'll do a few more practice problems with you just to kind of get practice. I would recommend that you pause the video and try them and then replay to check them. Or check the answer key that I've provided for you. And if there's any that you get wrong, then maybe just kind of put the video on to check the ones you got wrong. That would be probably your best option. So you don't have to watch the entire video if you kind of get the idea, but I'm just going to go through them so that if you do have a question you want to look back, it's explained for you. All right, so number 3, we have A is 1, B, and C there. So x equals negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C. And that's over 2 times A. So again, I'm always going for that discriminant. So I have negative 3 plus minus, and then it's a 2 on the bottom. So I'm going to find my discriminant to put that in there. So in my calculator, 3 squared minus 4 times, what was it? 1 and negative 4. Okay, times 1 and negative 4, which gives me 25. This is a nice one because it is a perfect square, so I can just break it up. Negative 3 plus 5 over 2, negative 3 minus 5 over 2. That's going to give me 2 over 2, negative 8 over 2. So my two answers are 1 and negative 4. All right. Okay, let's take a look at number 4. So for number 4, my A is 1, my B is 9, and my C is 20. So negative B plus minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C. And that's going to go over 2 times A. So I have negative 9 plus minus, and then on the bottom 2. And I'm going to go ahead and calculate that discriminant. So 9 squared minus 4 times 1 times 20. Okay, so 9 squared minus 4 times 1 times 20. And this time I get 1. So that's just 1. So now I can split it up because 1 is a perfect square. So I have negative 9 plus 1 over 2, negative 9 minus 1 over 2, which is negative 8 over 2. So x is going to equal negative 4. Or here we get negative 10 over 2. So x will equal negative 5. Okay, so now when we get down to the next one, we'll notice that it's not in standard form. So this is where you're going to have to move something over to the other side. So we're going to move that 6 over. So the first thing I'm going to do is rewrite this, x squared plus x minus 6 equals 0. So now I know my A is 1, my B is also 1, and my C is that negative 6. So I'm going to do negative B plus minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c over 2 times a. So now when I go to do my discriminant here, I have 1 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 6. So 1 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 6, and I end up with 25. So now I have negative 1 plus minus the square root of 25 over 2. And now I'm going to break it up. I have negative 1 plus 5 over 2, negative 1 minus 5 over 2. That's going to give me 4 over 2, which is 2. And here I get negative 6 over 2, which is negative 3. All right, hopefully so far so good. All right, a couple more. So here we have A, B, and C. So negative B plus minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C. And that's going to go over 2 times A. So when I go to find my discriminant, it is going to be, let's say, 4 squared minus 4 times negative 3 times 5. Okay, so we have 4 squared minus 4 times negative 3 times 5. And we get 76. Okay, so now again, this is not a perfect square. I get a decimal if I put that in my calculator. So I'm just going to go ahead and split it up. So I have negative 4 plus the square root of 76 over negative 6. Negative 4 minus the square root of 76 over negative 6. I'm going to put those in my calculator and get my decimals. So negative 4 plus the square root of 76. Just make sure you hit equals before you divide it by the negative 6. Otherwise, it won't come out correctly. So negative 0.79. Negative 0.79 is one answer. And then negative 4 minus the square root of 76. So negative 4 minus the square root of 76. Make sure you hit equals and then divide it by the negative 6. 2.12. Okay. All right, so we got 2 more left for today. So I'm going to move my 7 over. So 4x squared minus x minus 7 equals 0. So now I know A is 4, B is negative 1, and C is negative 7. So x equals negative B, so that double negative, plus or minus B squared minus 4 times A, which is 4, times C, which is negative 7, over 2 times A. Again, finding that discriminant. So we know that negative 1 is just going to be 1. And on the bottom, 2 times 4 is going to be 8. But we want to figure out what this discriminant is going to be. So we have negative 1 squared minus 4 times negative 7. Let me just double check, make sure I got that in right. Good. And that gives me 113. Now again, 113 is not perfect square, so we're going to have to leave it. So we have 1 plus the square root of 113 over 8, 1 minus the square root of 113 over 8, and we're going to get our decimal answers. So 1 plus the square root of 113, divide that by 8, we get 1.45. And now we're going to do 1 minus the square root of 113 and divide that by 8. And that's negative 1.2. All right, and then we got one question left. Again, we want to bring that over into standard form. So it'll be negative 3x squared plus x plus 5. So A will be negative 3, B will be 1, and C will be 5. So negative b plus minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times negative 3 times 5. And that's going to be over 2 times a. So we have negative 1 plus minus whatever's in that square root, and then we're going to get that negative on the bottom. So 1 squared minus 4 times negative 3 times 5. So we've got 1 squared, 1 squared minus 4 times, sorry, I forgot what it is, negative 3 and 5. Negative 3 times 5. We have 61 in there. So now that's not a perfect square, so we're going to split it up. Negative 1 plus radical 61 over negative 6. Negative 1 minus radical 1 over negative 6. And we're going to get our 2 decimal answers. So negative 1 plus the square root of 61. And we're dividing that by, I think it was negative 6, right? Yeah. Negative 6. Negative 1.14. And then negative 1 minus the square root of 61. Oops. And hit equals and divide that by negative 6. And we get 1.47. All right, so hopefully that helps you guys out. Quadratic formula is very basic. The biggest mistakes people make are they try to put too much in their calculator at once and you miss a parenthesis or a negative or something silly and it messes everything up. So my advice to you is find that discriminant first and don't really use the calculator until you have to, and use it piece by piece. Don't try to put the whole thing in at once. You could do it technically, but you're just setting yourself up for making mistakes because there's so much to put in. You miss one thing, it's going to give you the wrong answer. So please be careful with that. If you have any questions, reach out. We will have a meetup on Wednesday at 10:30. So feel free to join that. If you have any questions on this topic, we will be reviewing it again tomorrow. And that's it. Have a great rest of your day.